I woke up to find concrete barriers across my driveway and a woman in a pantsuit standing guard with a clipboard, telling me I couldn't access my own property because I'd violated community standards. She had no idea I was a retired U.S. Marshal who'd spent 25 years taking down people who thought they were above the law, but what she really didn't know was that blocking federal property access is a felony. My ranch easement happened to run right through what she thought was her domain. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Pine Ridge Valley. Montana, coffee brewing, horses snorting in the pasture, and the kind of silence that makes you remember why you left the city behind. My name is Marcus Sullivan, and after a quarter-century chasing fugitives across 3 states, I'd traded my badge for 40 acres of peace and a log cabin that my grandfather built in 1952. The plan was simple: raise a few head of cattle, fix things with my hands instead of a gun, and never deal with bureaucrats again. That plan lasted exactly 18 months. I'd heard rumors about Patricia Thornwell ever since the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision went up 2 miles down the valley. The developers had carved 80 cookie-cutter houses out of what used to be the Morrison family's wheat fields, complete with HOA bylaws thicker than a phone book and monthly fees that would choke a horse. But that was their business. My ranch predated their little kingdom by 70 years, and I figured we'd all just mind our own affairs. I figured wrong. The first sign of trouble came when I found a bright orange notice zip-tied to my mailbox on a Monday morning. Violation: unauthorized agricultural operations in residential zone. I read it twice. Sure, it had to be some kind of mistake. My cattle were on my land, behind my fences, same as they'd been since my grandfather's time. But there it was, signed by Patricia Thornwell, President, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, demanding I cease all livestock operations within 30 days. I called the number on the letterhead and got a voicemail message delivered in the kind of voice that suggested Patricia had once sold timeshares to senior citizens. You've reached the Meadowbrook Estates Community Standards Hotline. All violations must be addressed within the time frame specified to avoid escalated enforcement action. Escalated enforcement action on property she didn't own, in a county that hadn't changed its agricultural zoning since the Eisenhower administration. I drove down to the Meadowbrook Community Center that Thursday evening, figuring I'd clear up the confusion in person. The meeting was held in a beige room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, with maybe 15 residents scattered among folding chairs that had seen better decades. Patricia commanded the front of the room like a general briefing troops before battle, wearing a navy blazer and the kind of smile that real estate agents practice in mirrors. As I was saying, she continued, clearly annoyed by my interruption. Property values in our community have declined 8% in the last quarter, primarily due to incompatible land uses in the surrounding area. She gestured toward a PowerPoint slide showing a grainy photo of my barn. Agricultural odors, vehicle noise, and livestock disturbances are creating an undesirable environment for our homeowners. I stood up slowly, the way I used to when entering a courtroom to testify. Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. That's my property in your slideshow, and it's not subject to your HOA regulations. Patricia's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Sir, community standards apply to all properties within our jurisdiction. If you'd like to file a formal appeal, the process is outlined in Section 47 of our governing documents. Your jurisdiction ends at your property lines, I said, keeping my voice level. My ranch has been operating under state agricultural permits since before your subdivision existed. The room went quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Patricia's smile finally cracked. Mr. Sullivan. Marcus Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan. I don't think you understand how community development works. When new residential areas are established, existing land uses must conform to updated standards that protect property values and quality of life. I'd heard enough double talk from federal prosecutors to know when someone was spinning fiction into fact. Miss Thornwell, I don't think you understand how property law works, but I'm sure we can figure this out without lawyers getting involved. That's when Patricia made her first real mistake. She laughed, not a polite chuckle, but the kind of dismissive bark that says she'd already decided I was some ignorant cowboy who wouldn't know a legal document from a feed bill. Mr. Sullivan, the Meadowbrook Estates Development Agreement includes protective covenants that supersede individual property claims. If you continue operating in violation of community standards, we'll have no choice but to pursue enforcement through appropriate channels. I nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. Could you repeat that part about superseding individual property claims? I want to make sure I quote you accurately when I discuss this with the county attorney. The smugness drained from Patricia's face faster than water through a busted dam. This meeting is not being recorded without consent of all parties. Actually, Montana's a one-party consent state. But don't worry, I'm the only party that matters right now. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Miss Thornwell, I've been dealing with people who think rules don't apply to them for most of my adult life. Usually, they learn better once the paperwork starts flying. I'm hoping you're smarter than most. Patricia's jaw tightened. Are you threatening me? Mr. Sullivan? No, ma'am. I'm educating you. There's a difference. I left the meeting with a folder full of their HOA documents and a pretty clear picture of what I was dealing with. Patricia Thornwell wasn't just some overzealous neighborhood busybody. She was a former real estate agent who'd lost her license after the state caught her inflating property appraisals and steering clients toward overpriced homes. The HOA presidency was her comeback attempt, a chance to wield the kind of authority she'd lost when the licensing board permanently revoked her credentials. The research took me about 2 hours. Patricia had been elected HOA president by a margin of 3 votes after promising to enhance property values through aggressive standards enforcement. Her campaign literature was full of vague threats about incompatible land uses and rural encroachment that would destroy the suburban paradise Meadowbrook residents had purchased. What she hadn't mentioned was the lawsuit filed against her by 17 former clients, or the cease and desist order that prohibited her from representing herself as a licensed real estate professional. Patricia Thornwell was playing with other people's money and using their fears to rebuild a reputation she'd destroyed through her own greed. But that was all background noise compared to what I found in the county records office the next morning. You looking for anything specific? Asked Janet Myers. The clerk who'd been filing property documents since before computers were invented. The Meadowbrook Estates Development Agreement. Specifically, any protective covenants that might affect surrounding properties. Janet pulled up the digital files and frowned at her monitor. That's interesting. What's interesting? The development agreement shows the subdivision boundaries, but there's no mention of external property restrictions. And look at this. She turned the screen toward me. The access easement for Meadowbrook runs right through your property. Has since the original plat was filed. I leaned forward. Explain that again. When the developers bought the Morrison land, they needed road access from County Highway 15. Your grandfather granted them an easement in 1998 in exchange for road maintenance and emergency access rights. It's right here in the documentation. The pieces started clicking together. Patricia's subdivision depended on an access road that crossed my property, and according to the easement agreement, any attempt to restrict my land use could void their right-of-way. Janet, what would happen if someone tried to prevent me from using my own property? She read through the easement language carefully. Says here that any interference with the grantor's agricultural operations or property access constitutes a material breach. The grantor, that's you, would have grounds to terminate the agreement with 30 days' notice. I thanked Janet and drove home with a copy of every document related to the Meadowbrook development. Patricia thought she could bully me into compliance by threatening legal action. What she didn't realize was that I held the legal equivalent of a nuclear option, cut off my access to my own property, and I could cut off her community's access to the outside world, but I wasn't ready to push that button yet. 25 years of law enforcement had taught me to build a case methodically, gathering evidence and documentation before making a move. Patricia was escalating her harassment campaign, and I wanted every threat, every violation notice, and every illegal demand documented before I brought the hammer down. I didn't have to wait long. The concrete barriers appeared on Tuesday morning like some kind of bureaucratic magic trick, 3 interlocking sections blocking my driveway, each one stamped with "Property of Meadowbrook Estates HOA" in official-looking letters. Patricia stood beside them wearing her trademark blazer and holding her ever-present clipboard, flanked by 2 men in security uniforms who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out as I climbed out of my truck. "As you can see, we've implemented temporary access restrictions, pending resolution of your compliance issues." I walked closer, noting the way the security guards shifted nervously when they recognized the look in my eyes. 25 years of dealing with armed fugitives teaches you how to project authority without saying a word. "Miss Thornwell, you've just committed criminal trespass and interference with property access. I'm giving you one opportunity to remove these barriers before I call the sheriff." Patricia's smile was pure poison. "Mr. Sullivan, community safety supersedes individual convenience. These barriers will remain in place until you bring your property into compliance with established standards." "What standards? Specifically?" She consulted her clipboard like she was reading biblical scripture. "Livestock operations within 500 feet of residential properties, operation of commercial vehicles on private roadways, and maintenance of structures that negatively impact neighborhood aesthetics." Every word was carefully chosen nonsense designed to sound official while meaning absolutely nothing. But Patricia had made a fatal error in strategy. She'd moved from bureaucratic harassment to physical obstruction, crossing the line from annoying to criminal. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "Sheriff's Department," came the dispatcher's voice. "This is Marcus Sullivan on Pine Ridge Road. I need a deputy out here for criminal trespass and obstruction of property access." Patricia's confidence wavered slightly, but she held her ground. "Mr. Sullivan, you're wasting county resources on a civil matter. The HOA has legal authority to enforce community standards. The HOA has authority over HOA property. This is my driveway on my land, and those barriers constitute criminal obstruction." Deputy Ray Coleman arrived 20 minutes later, looking like he'd rather be writing speeding tickets than mediating neighbor disputes. I'd known Ray for 3 years, ever since he'd helped me round up some cattle that had wandered onto the highway after a fence break. He was solid law enforcement, methodical, fair, and smart enough to recognize when someone was trying to blow smoke up his backside. "Morning. Marcus, what's the situation here?" I gestured toward the barriers. "Miss Thornwell and her associates have blocked access to my property without legal authority. I'd like them removed and trespass charges filed." Ray examined the concrete sections, noting their position across my driveway. "Ma'am, can you show me documentation that gives you authority to restrict access to Mr. Sullivan's property?" Patricia produced a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Deputy, the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association has protective authority over all properties within our jurisdiction. Mr. Sullivan's violations of community standards pose a threat to public safety and property values." Ray flipped through the documents, his expression growing more skeptical with each page. "Ma'am, I don't see anything here that gives you authority over property outside your subdivision, and Mr. Sullivan's ranch isn't part of your HOA. The development agreement clearly states, the development agreement that I'm looking at shows your subdivision boundaries, and they don't include this property." Ray handed the folder back to Patricia. "Ma'am, You need to remove these barriers immediately. Blocking access to someone's property is a misdemeanor offense. Patricia's face flushed red. Deputy, you're obviously not familiar with community development law. I'll be contacting your supervisor about this matter. Ray's expression hardened. Ma'am, I'm familiar enough with the law to know criminal trespass when I see it. Remove the barriers now. Or, I'll arrest you for obstruction and interference with property rights. That's when Patricia played her final card. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Yes, this is Patricia Thornwell, president of Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I need to report harassment and intimidation by a local resident. Yes, he's threatening our community safety officials. Marcus Sullivan on Pine Ridge Road. Ray and I exchanged glances. In my federal days, I'd seen plenty of people try to talk their way out of arrests by claiming they were the real victims. It never worked, but it always made the eventual charges more serious. Ma'am, Ray said patiently, who exactly are you calling? The county commissioner's office. Commissioner Bradley has assured our community that law enforcement will support HOA authority in matters of public safety. Ray's eyebrows went up. Ma'am, Commissioner Bradley doesn't supervise law enforcement operations, and he certainly doesn't have authority to override state property law. Patricia's conversation continued for another few minutes, growing more heated as whoever was on the other end apparently failed to provide the support she expected. When she finally hung up, her face had gone from red to pale. The barriers stay, she announced, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Ray sighed and reached for his handcuffs. Ma'am, you're under arrest for criminal trespass and interference with property access. This is harassment, Patricia shrieked, as Ray guided her hands behind her back. I'm a community official. You can't arrest me for enforcing legitimate regulations. Ma'am, you're not a community official. You're the president of a homeowners association, which gives you authority over HOA property and HOA members. Mr. Sullivan is neither. As Ray loaded Patricia into his patrol car, the two security guards quickly began moving the concrete barriers out of my driveway. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 25, approached me nervously. Mr. Sullivan, we're really sorry about this. Miss Thornwell told us you were violating court orders and we were helping with legal enforcement. I nodded. Son, next time someone asks you to help with legal enforcement, make sure you see the actual court order and make sure it's signed by a judge, not an HOA president. The barriers disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared, and my driveway was clear again. But I knew this was far from over. Patricia had committed a serious tactical error by escalating to physical obstruction, and her arrest would either teach her the limits of her authority or drive her to even more desperate measures. Given what I'd learned about her background and psychology, I was betting on desperate measures. The call came at 6 the next morning, jarring me out of the first decent night's sleep I'd had in a week. Mr. Sullivan, this is Commissioner Bradley's office. The commissioner would like to meet with you this morning to discuss the incident with Miss Thornwell. I was instantly awake. What kind of discussion? The commissioner feels there may have been some misunderstanding about jurisdictional authority. He's hoping to resolve this matter without further legal complications. Where and when? Commissioner Bradley's office at 9 o'clock. If that's convenient, I arrived at the county building 15 minutes early. A habit developed through years of federal court appearances, Commissioner Tom Bradley was exactly what I'd expected. A glad-handing politician in his late 50s who'd never met a development project he couldn't support or a campaign contribution he couldn't accept. Mr. Sullivan, good to meet you. Though I wish it were under better circumstances, Bradley's handshake was firm but practiced. The grip of someone who'd learned that physical contact creates psychological advantage. Please, have a seat. Coffee? I'm good. Thanks. What can I do for you? Commissioner? Bradley settled behind his desk, clasping his hands in a gesture that probably tested well with focus groups. Marcus, may I call you Marcus? I understand there was some confusion yesterday regarding HOA authority and property access. No confusion on my part. Miss Thornwell blocked my driveway without legal authority, and Deputy Coleman arrested her for criminal trespass. Yes. Well, that's where I'm hoping we can find some common ground. Bradley opened a file folder. You see, the Meadowbrook development represents a significant investment in our county's economic future. Property tax revenue, construction jobs, and increased commercial activity. It's exactly the kind of growth we need to attract. I waited for him to get to the point. The thing is, Marcus, developments like Meadowbrook depend on stable property values and attractive living environments. When new residents invest their life savings in homes, they expect certain protections. Protections from what? Well, agricultural operations can sometimes create conflicts with residential expectations. Odors, noise, traffic from large vehicles. I'm sure you can understand the concern. The picture was becoming clearer. Patricia hadn't been operating alone. She had political support from a county commissioner who valued development revenue over property rights. Commissioner, are you suggesting I should change how I operate my ranch to accommodate people who chose to build houses next to an existing agricultural operation? Bradley's smile became strained. I'm suggesting we explore solutions that work for everyone. Perhaps some modifications to your operations. Maybe relocating certain activities farther from the residential area, such as moving livestock operations to the back of your property, restricting heavy vehicle traffic during certain hours. That sort of thing. I leaned back in my chair. Commissioner, let me make sure I understand. You want me to modify legal agricultural operations on my own property to accommodate the preferences of people who don't own my property and have no legal authority over my property. I'm talking about being a good neighbor. Marcus, no. You're talking about illegal pressure to surrender property rights. And I'm wondering what Patricia Thornwell promised you in exchange for this little conversation. Bradley's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. A county commissioner calling a private citizen to pressure them into surrendering legal rights to benefit a political supporter. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. For the record, Commissioner, are you asking me to modify legal agricultural operations on my property to accommodate HOA demands? Bradley stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. I agree. But Commissioner, you might want to review the county ethics guidelines regarding official pressure on behalf of private parties. I've got copies if you need them. I left the county building with confirmation of what I'd suspected. Patricia's harassment campaign had official backing from a commissioner who was either getting paid or getting promised future development opportunities. The arrest hadn't deterred. Harriet had driven her to escalate through political channels, but escalation works both ways. And Patricia was about to learn that Federal Law Enforcement Officer 7 retired once don't respond well to political pressure. The envelope arrived by certified mail the next afternoon, thick enough to stop a bullet, and stamped with the seal of Thornwell and Associates Legal Services. I almost laughed at the return address before remembering that Patricia's real estate license revocation hadn't prevented her from starting a legal consulting business. Inside was a cease and desist order demanding I immediately stop all agricultural operations within 500 feet of Meadowbrook Estates properties. Remove all livestock from areas visible from residential homes. And restrict vehicle traffic to designated hours. The document was signed by Patricia Thornwell, identified as Community Standards Legal Representative. The legal language was impressive for someone without a law degree. But it was also completely meaningless. Patricia had created an official-looking document with no legal authority whatsoever, hoping I'd be intimidated enough to comply. Instead, I drove into town and made copies of everything: Patricia's arrest report, Commissioner Bradley's attempted pressure, the cease and desist order, and the original development documents showing the access easement. Then I called a number I hadn't dialed in 3 years. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Helena Field Office. This is retired Deputy Marshal Marcus Sullivan. I need to speak with someone about potential corruption and conspiracy charges involving local officials. Agent Sarah Chen had worked organized crime cases in Chicago before transferring to Montana for the outdoor lifestyle and lower stress levels. She probably wasn't expecting a case involving HOA harassment and county commissioner corruption to land on her desk. But federal law is federal law. Marcus, good to hear from you. What's the situation? I laid out the timeline: Patricia's harassment campaign, the illegal barriers, Commissioner Bradley's pressure, and the fake legal documents. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. So we've got conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law, possible extortion, and definitely mail fraud with those fake legal documents, she summarized. But I need more evidence before we can move on the commissioner. Right now, it's your word against his. What if I could get him to repeat the pressure in a recorded conversation? That would change things significantly. But Marcus, you'd be operating without official protection. If this goes sideways, you're on your own. Understood. But Patricia's not going to stop until someone with real authority makes her stop. And Commissioner Bradley is enabling her because he thinks he can pressure private citizens without consequences. Chen agreed to open a preliminary investigation while I gathered additional evidence. The plan was simple: provoke Patricia into more illegal behavior while documenting everything, then use that evidence to pressure Commissioner Bradley into admitting his role in the conspiracy. But first, I needed to send Patricia a message that would drive her to even more desperate measures. I spent that evening crafting a letter that was polite, professional, and guaranteed to send Patricia into a fury. The key was appearing weak while actually setting a trap. Dear Miss Thornwell, it began. I've consulted with agricultural attorneys regarding your cease and desist order, and they've advised me that continuing to fight might be more expensive than modifying my operations. While I believe I have the legal right to continue current agricultural activities, I'm willing to discuss reasonable compromises that address community concerns while preserving my basic property rights. The letter went on to suggest a meeting to negotiate specific modifications to my ranch operations, implying that I was ready to surrender under pressure. It was complete fiction designed to make Patricia believe she was winning. I mailed the letter on Friday and waited for her response. It came faster than I'd expected. Saturday morning brought a phone call from Patricia herself, her voice bubbling with barely contained triumph. Mr. Sullivan, I received your letter, and I'm pleased to see you're taking a more reasonable approach to community relations. Miss Thornwell, I just want to resolve this situation without expensive legal battles. Of course, I think you'll find that compliance with community standards is much simpler than you've been led to believe. We arranged to meet Sunday afternoon at the Meadowbrook Community Center. Patricia wanted the meeting on her turf, surrounded by her supporters. Perfect. I arrived at the community center with a folder full of documents and a digital recorder, small enough to fit in my shirt pocket. The meeting room was packed with Meadowbrook residents, most of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Patricia held court at the front of the room, dressed in her best power suit and radiating the confidence of someone who believed she'd finally broken her opponent. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, Mr. Sullivan has asked for this meeting to discuss bringing his property into compliance with community standards. I think this represents a positive step toward resolving our ongoing concerns. I took the seat Patricia indicated, noting the way she'd arranged the room to make me appear isolated and outnumbered. Standard intimidation tactics. But she was about to discover that federal agents don't intimidate easily. Miss Thornwell, before we discuss any modifications to my operations, I'd like to clarify the legal basis for your authority over my property. Patricia's smile flickered slightly. As I've explained, community standards apply to all properties within our jurisdiction. And your jurisdiction extends how far beyond Meadowbrook Estates property lines? The development agreement establishes protective authority over surrounding areas that could impact resident quality of life. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Patricia was about to repeat her false claims about legal authority in front of a room full of witnesses, with my recorder capturing every word. Miss Thornwell, could you specify which court granted you authority over non-HOA properties? Community development law doesn't require individual court orders for each enforcement action. Actually, it does. Property rights are protected by state and federal law. Any attempt to restrict legal property use requires either ownership rights or court orders. Patricia's face flushed red. Mr. Sullivan, you're obviously not familiar with modern property law. Community standards supersede individual claims when public welfare is at stake. Public welfare? How does my cattle ranch threaten public welfare? Agricultural operations create health hazards. Noise pollution. And property value degradation that affects the entire community. Based on what evidence? Patricia consulted her ever-present clipboard. We've documented numerous violations of environmental and safety standards. Could you show me those documents? That information is confidential pending legal proceedings. I leaned forward. Miss Thornwell, there are no legal proceedings. You've filed no court cases, obtained no injunctions, and received no official authority to restrict my property use. What you've done is create fake legal documents and attempted to intimidate a private citizen into surrendering constitutional rights. The room went silent. Patricia's supporters shifted uncomfortably as they realized their HOA president might have been lying to them about her legal authority. Mr. Sullivan, Patricia said carefully, if you're unwilling to negotiate in good faith, I'm unwilling to surrender legal rights based on fake authority. And I'm curious about your relationship with Commissioner Bradley. Patricia's face went pale. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that Commissioner Bradley attempted to pressure me into compliance with your demands, which suggests coordination between public officials and private parties to deprive constitutional rights. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. Conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law is a federal felony. Patricia stood up abruptly, her hands shaking slightly. This meeting is over. Actually, Miss Thornwell, this is just beginning. I pulled out copies of the arrest report, the fake cease and desist order, and documentation of the access easement that Meadowbrook Estates depended on for road access. Ladies and gentlemen, I address the room. I want you to understand what your HOA president has done. She's claimed legal authority she doesn't possess, filed fake legal documents, and conspired with county officials to pressure private citizens into surrendering property rights. Patricia tried to interrupt, but I continued. More importantly, she's jeopardized your community's legal access to public roads. That got everyone's attention. I explained the access easement, how Patricia's harassment campaign constituted breach of contract, and what would happen if I exercised my right to terminate the agreement. Your subdivision depends on a road that crosses my property. Miss Thornwell's illegal actions have given me grounds to close that road and strand your community. The room erupted in angry voices. Residents demanding explanations from Patricia about legal authority she'd never possessed and roads they might lose access to. Patricia tried to maintain control, but her support was crumbling in real time. Mr. Sullivan is obviously trying to intimidate our community, she said desperately. These threats prove that he's been the aggressor all along. Miss Thornwell, I said quietly, I'm not threatening anyone. I'm educating your community about the legal consequences of your actions. The choice of how to respond is entirely yours. Patricia grabbed her folder and stormed out of the meeting, but not before turning back to deliver one final threat. "Mr. Sullivan, you have no idea what you're dealing with. This community will not be intimidated by some washed-up federal agent with delusions of authority." The room fell silent again. I smiled and pulled out my phone, showing the voice recording app that had been running throughout the meeting. "Thank you, Miss Thornwell. That statement will be very useful in federal court." The Monday morning phone call came from Commissioner Bradley's office, but this time the tone was very different. "Mr. Sullivan, Commissioner Bradley would like to schedule another meeting to discuss the Meadowbrook situation." "What kind of discussion?" "The Commissioner feels there may have been some miscommunication about the county's position regarding HOA authority. I'll be there at 10 o'clock. Commissioner Bradley looked like he'd aged 5 years since our last meeting. The confident politician had been replaced by a nervous public official who'd realized that threatening Federal Agent 7 retired ones was a career-limiting mistake. "Marcus, thank you for coming. I want to clear up any misunderstanding about the county's role in this HOA matter." I settled into the same chair I'd occupied a week earlier. "Commissioner, there's no misunderstanding. You attempted to pressure me into surrendering property rights to benefit a political supporter. I think you mischaracterized our previous conversation. I was simply trying to mediate a neighbor dispute." I pulled out my phone and played back our previous meeting. Bradley's voice filled the office, clearly asking me to modify legal agricultural operations to accommodate HOA demands. "Commissioner, I've shared this recording with the FBI. Agent Chen is very interested in your relationship with Patricia Thornwell." Bradley's face went pale. "The FBI? Conspiracy to deprive constitutional rights is a federal crime. Add in Patricia's fake legal documents and mail fraud charges, and you're looking at serious federal time. Marcus, I think we can resolve this without involving federal authorities. How do you propose to do that?" Bradley opened his desk drawer and pulled out an official-looking document. "The county is prepared to issue a formal statement clarifying that HOA authority doesn't extend beyond subdivision boundaries and that agricultural operations on private property are protected by state law. What else? We'll also launch an ethics investigation into any inappropriate contact between county officials and HOA representatives." I read through the proposed statement. It was comprehensive, publicly acknowledging that Patricia's claims of authority were false and that county officials had no power to restrict legal agricultural operations. "Commissioner, I want this statement published in the county newspaper and posted on the county website." "Agreed. And I want Patricia Thornwell's fake legal consulting business investigated for practicing law without a license." Bradley nodded reluctantly. "I'll contact the State Bar Association. One more thing. If Patricia makes any further attempts to restrict my property use, I want your office to respond immediately with criminal charges." "Understood." I left the county building with a signed agreement that effectively ended Patricia's harassment campaign and destroyed any political support she might have enjoyed. But I still had one more card to play. Tuesday morning brought a certified letter from my attorney to every resident of Meadowbrook Estates. The letter explained the access easement situation, Patricia's breach of contract through her harassment campaign, and my legal right to terminate road access with 30 days' notice. But the letter also offered a solution. If Meadowbrook residents voted to remove Patricia as HOA president and elected new leadership committed to respecting property rights, I would agree to maintain the access easement under its original terms. The vote was scheduled for Thursday evening. Patricia tried to rally support with an emergency robocall claiming I was trying to destroy their community. But her credibility had been shattered by public exposure of her fake legal authority. When Thursday arrived, Meadowbrook residents voted 67-3 to remove Patricia as HOA president and install new leadership. The 3 votes in favor of Patricia came from Patricia herself and 2 relatives who'd moved to Meadowbrook specifically to support her political ambitions. Friday morning brought the final phone call from Agent Chen. "Marcus, We've got enough evidence for federal charges. But Patricia's agreed to a plea deal. She'll surrender her legal consulting business license, pay restitution for all fake legal documents, and accept a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with you or interference with your property. What about Commissioner Bradley? He's agreed to resign from office and cooperate with our investigation into county corruption. No criminal charges. But his political career is over. I hung up the phone and walked out to my porch, looking across 40 acres of peaceful Montana ranch land that belonged to me and always would. The horses were grazing in the morning sun, cattle moving slowly toward the creek, and the silence was broken only by the sound of wind through the pine trees. Patricia Thornwell had learned the hard way that fake authority eventually meets real authority, and real authority always wins. She'd lost her HOA presidency, her fake legal business, her political support, and any remaining credibility in the community she'd tried to control. But more importantly, she'd learned that some lines should never be crossed. When you threaten someone's home, their livelihood, and their fundamental rights, you'd better be prepared for the consequences. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled into the rocking chair my grandfather had built 60 years ago. The morning was quiet, the way mornings should be in a place where a man can live in peace on his own land. And if anyone else wanted to challenge that peace, they were welcome to try. I'd be ready. 6 months later, Meadowbrook Estates had transformed into the kind of community it was originally meant to be. The new HOA president, retired teacher Margaret Willis, ran monthly meetings that lasted 40 minutes instead of 4 hours and focused on actual community improvements rather than manufactured violations. Property values had actually increased once residents stopped living in fear of arbitrary fines and fake legal threats. Margaret stopped by the ranch one autumn afternoon with a handwritten invitation to their first annual harvest festival, complete with pumpkin carving, apple cider, and a barbecue contest. "Marcus, we'd be honored if you judged the chili competition. After everything you've done for our community, it's the least we can offer." I accepted the invitation and spent a pleasant Saturday afternoon among neighbors who no longer saw my ranch as a threat to their property values, but as a reminder of the agricultural heritage that made Pine Ridge Valley special. Kids fed carrots to my horses while their parents asked genuine questions about cattle ranching and sustainable farming practices. The festival raised $3,000 for a new playground and established a tradition that continued for years afterward. More importantly, it demonstrated what communities could accomplish when leadership focused on bringing people together rather than driving them apart. Word of Patricia's downfall spread beyond Pine Ridge Valley, attracting attention from other communities dealing with similar HOA tyranny. I received calls from homeowners across Montana and neighboring states asking for advice on dealing with overzealous board members and fake legal authority. One case particularly stood out: a veterans' housing development in Wyoming where an HOA president was threatening to foreclose on disabled veterans' homes over minor landscaping violations. I spent 2 weeks helping document the harassment campaign and connecting the veterans with federal authorities who specialized in civil rights violations. The Wyoming case resulted in criminal charges against 3 HOA board members and a new state law protecting veterans from discriminatory enforcement actions. More importantly, it demonstrated that Patricia's tactics weren't unique across the country. Petty tyrants were using HOA authority to bully vulnerable populations who lacked the resources to fight back. Agent Chen eventually offered me a consulting position with the FBI's white-collar crime division, helping investigate HOA fraud and corruption cases that cross state lines. I turned down the full-time position but agreed to assist with cases involving veterans, elderly residents, or other vulnerable populations. The work was satisfying in a way that regular law enforcement had never been. Instead of chasing fugitives and processing cases, I was helping ordinary people protect their homes and families from predators who hid behind fake authority and legal-sounding documents. Patricia herself disappeared from Pine Ridge Valley within a month of her HOA removal, reportedly moving to Arizona to live with relatives. Rumors suggested she'd tried to start a property management business in Phoenix, but state licensing authorities had been alerted to her Montana activities and rejected her applications. Commissioner Bradley's resignation triggered a special election that brought fresh leadership to county government. The new commissioner, a former small business owner named David Chen, campaigned on a platform of protecting property rights and limiting government overreach. His first official act was establishing new ethics guidelines, prohibiting county officials from interfering in private disputes on behalf of political supporters. As winter settled over Pine Ridge Valley, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned from Patricia's harassment campaign. The experience had reinforced my belief that ordinary citizens possess extraordinary power when they're willing to stand up for their rights and hold authority figures accountable for their actions. But it had also reminded me that freedom requires constant vigilance. Patricia's rise to power hadn't happened overnight. It had been enabled by residents who preferred quiet compliance to confrontational resistance, and by public officials who valued political convenience over constitutional principles. The ranch remained peaceful, the way it was meant to be. But I kept Agent Chen's number in my phone and maintained relationships with attorneys who specialized in civil rights law, because somewhere out there, another Patricia was probably terrorizing another community, and another Marcus might need help learning how to fight back. Some battles end when the shooting stops. Others end when the last tyrant learns that fake authority eventually meets real authority, and real authority always wins.